I first of all just want to kick off, I suppose, with some just little notes that you ought to be aware of, which is that this is the first student conference that we have had at the Oxford Internet Institute. And we are immensely proud of everything that the team has done to put this together today. I mean, it is unthinkable to us that really, we only had students, a few years after 2006. And now we're in a place where we can run something as great as this, showcasing not just the work that's being done at OII, work across Oxford, work from our alumni. We now have alumni in great jobs around the world, and work from the rest of you doing great internet research around the UK and beyond. So that's the first thing to note, is that we are immensely proud of what you guys have done today, and I can't thank you enough. It's been so well organised, we may actually have to employ you as part of the events team, I think, in the future. The second thing I wanted just to note, for those of you that don't know the OII, we are, we're a department at the University of Oxford. Unlike most other departments, though, we're a multidisciplinary department. So, the intention of this event today, to bring people together from across disciplines, is something that's very dear to our hearts, something that we do every day, all day. I think that one of the things that's so great about research in this sphere, though, is that it is relatively easy to find common interests and a common vocabulary, even if you're coming, we have psychologists talking to lawyers, talking to geographers, and I very much hope that over the course of the day you're going to find that sort of common vocabulary, areas of interest, new connections, new people to put into your network, and for me that would be one of the greatest outcomes I think that we could really have. The programme that you've got is a really, really superb one. I mean, the focus on connected life is something that I think, we constantly struggle at the OII to explain to people what we do. Our current tagline is that we try and understand life online. Well, what does it mean to live online? Clearly, for most of us, it means to be connected, but it means to be connected in so many different ways. So it means to be connected to friends and family around the world. It means to be connected to your friends. It means being connected to the different applications and services that you use every day. And over the course of the day, I very much hope that the different speakers that we have, the different panellists, presentations, posters and so on, will for all of us sort of pick out different aspects of this that we might not have thought about before. We're going to kick it off, though, with a really, really excellent keynote speaker. I'm particularly delighted that Nick is here, because actually he first came to the OII in 2006 for something that we call our summer doctoral programme, where we bring together really great PhD students from around the world to do 2 weeks of intensive study. I hadn't realised, but apparently that was the first year of his PhD. So that says quite a lot, that you can go from doing the first year of your PhD in 2006 to being the keynote speaker in 2014. Currently, obviously, associate professor at the LSE, probably the best place other than the OII. Sorry?
Assistant professor.
Assistant professor. I do apologise. Assistant professor. We've only just introduced these terms in Oxford,
it's very
so we're just getting used to them. Yeah. Professor, anything is good. At the LSE, if we had to pick one rival, who'd be our best rival, it probably would be the LSE. So we're pleased to bring you in today. Previously, though, obviously in East Anglia, and then before that at Royal Holloway with, again, somebody very close to our heart, which was Andrew Chadwick. In terms of the work that you're doing at the moment, working in an incredibly important field, looking at the impact of the internet on politics, elections, and government, and also embracing sort of one of the sort of really big themes we're very interested in at the moment, which is big data. So I don't know if you're going to talk about that at all. I think the other thing that I particularly like about Nick's work, though, is that you're one of those great academics that can cross the boundaries, if you like, between research, academic life, and the application of it. You've done work previously with the Fabian Society, looking at your most sort of recent work, debates around sort of Nick Clegg and Nigel Farage. Again, it has very clear application. So, again, thinking about what the OII does and what I hope many of you do, it's not just about doing excellent research, it's about doing research that has an impact, has application, has meaning, connections, I suppose, if you like. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Nick for our keynote, and I think we have until 10:30, is that correct? Fantastic. Can we give him a welcome, please? Thank you.
Horrible moment just as I was being introduced here, where the screen turns itself off 10 seconds before you're due to stand up. I'm wearing a radio mic. Is that okay? Is that working okay? Lovely. While the screen is just coming back to life, I guess I could sort of give 3 sort of notes or points of interest while this is happening. I had planned to say these things anyway, so it's okay. This is not me improvising. The first thing to say is, for those of you who are doing PhDs, particularly outside institutions, do please think about the OII summer doctoral programme. For me, it was a hugely formative and very inspiring thing. I think it's one of the most wonderful things anywhere in the world for people in our field to do. So I would really, really strongly advise you to apply for it. The other thing I wanted to really thank are all the people who've worked really, really hard to organise this conference today. This is my first keynote, so I have got no kind of frame of reference as to whether conferences are normally this organised, but it seems exceptionally organised. And the final thing I just wanted to know, which I'm sure will be mentioned by lots of people over the course of today, is the OII is sort of undergoing a process of change at the moment because Professor Bill Dutton is moving on. But I just really wanted, as an outsider to that institution, to acknowledge all Bill's work over the past decade or so, is it? Yeah. You know, who's built this fantastic and really inspiring institution from the ground up. So, you know, if you're not at Oxford, do come here. They have great events and do get involved. I've noticed that my slides have not returned. It's not...
It's because they're not on the internet.
Okay, we can solve this problem.
Let me try to ramble on a bit about what I'm going to be talking about today.
Yeah, we can just do that.
So this is a great theme for a conference, yeah? The notion of the connected life. And I'm looking forward to going to lots of panels today where people are going to talk about this in slightly different ways, across disciplinary perspectives, and interpret the way this idea of connection and what I'm going to talk about, first of all, actually is disconnection, and maybe reconnection in different ways. So what is it that I am going to be talking about today? I'm stalling for time because I think we're almost there.
Almost there.
What I want to talk about really is something, even if your background is not political science, I'm a political scientist, thank you. Even if your background is not political science, you cannot have failed to have noticed from popular coverage that I'm not a Mac user. Do I just hit the cursor to go forward? Lovely, okay. So you will not have failed to have noticed that we are living in an age where people are constantly talking about the problem of politics. Yeah? And I have chosen to encapsulate this neatly for the purposes of today's conference as, are we living in an age of disconnect? I'm going to drill down and talk about what that might mean in a little second. But then the other question is, well, does technology, loosely termed, offer some ways to think about reconnection? I'm going to talk about, happily, big data, just because it's something I've been thinking about recently. You may all have your own ideas as to what, the most technologies to be most hopeful about. It may be social media and social movement organisations. It may be things like WikiLeaks that give people access to greater amounts of information more quickly, or give them greater control over information, or whatever. I'm going to talk about big data as one possibility for reconnection. And actually, I'll preempt what I'm going to say, which is I'm a little bit cynical, or at least I think there are reasons to be concerned. But we will move on to that shortly. OK, so if we're thinking about an age of disconnect, well, here's the obvious story from recent events. Yeah, this is the European election, where parties from the left and the right, and maybe just the anti-political, if we think about the Five-Star Movement in Italy, have seemed to gain a huge amount of ground over established political parties. So how do we understand these events? Well, there are a number of narratives out there. There's a lot of data out there on different things trying to explain it. But maybe one broad encapsulation is that people are frustrated with traditional political institutions. I'm going to talk about this in two particular ways. So the first issue is a numeric institutional issue, which is that traditional mechanisms for forming a connection between citizens and governments seem to be failing, or at least people are disillusioned with them and not using them. Then I want to talk about something broader, which is particularly this idea that we are living in an age of democratic crisis. Yeah, there was a big article in The Economist about 6 months ago. Yeah, so this has entered into kind of popular or relatively popular discourse. OK. So this is like the classic data set if you want to argue people are disconnected from traditional politics. Yeah? This is it's for 4 countries: France, Germany, UK, US. And what it basically does is plots the election turnout between 1945 and the present. And there are undulations there. Things go up, things go down. You know, there are various discrete factors in any election, like is it a close election? That tends to get people voting. Are there candidates that enthuse people, a sort of a Blair or an Obama that gets people out? But by and large, the story here is quite clear. Yeah, there's a downward trend. People are voting less. If I were to show you this diagram for young voters, by the way, it would be even more acute. In fact, a really lovely little factoid for you, which is that in 1960, or sort of elections around 1960 in the United Kingdom, young people were actually more likely to vote than older people, presumably the argument being that, you know, it was exciting to go and vote for the first time. They had a higher turnout. Now it's considerably lower. This is an equally sort of concerning graph if you are in favour of very traditional ways of doing politics and you believe in that institutions can provide a connection. This is the UK. This data is based upon, but I could equally show you graphs for other countries that show broadly similar patterns. And what it really shows is the membership of the major political parties in the UK. So the Conservatives, Labour Party, and Liberal Democrats, because they changed their name in the 80s. And what you can see here is a kind of a very sharp decline in the case of the Conservatives, quite a solid decline in the case of Labour. So people are joining political parties less, yeah? Now, why is this a problem? Well, I think it's quite nicely encapsulated in this image from 1910. Yeah, so this is the traditional view of the Labour Party, or social democratic parties, right? Which is that they represent a particular proportion of the population, in this case, a mobilised, politicised working class. And with that, they have a sense of a political programme. Yeah, they would actually like to mobilise that political group in order to achieve their goals, in order to maybe push an ideology that reflects their views. So, in this sense, mass political parties were, at least theoretically, and you know, if you delve into the history, it becomes a lot more complicated than this, but broadly, they were once the organs of political mobilisation. Yeah? They were the bodies that connected citizens to government. And what they crucially also did was reflected something. Yeah? They reflected the body politic. So they reflected the areas of disagreement and the areas that people you know, couldn't agree upon. So this might be class, continental Europe, probably very often religion. So the key point here is political parties reflected citizens' everyday lived existence. Yeah, they reflected their identity, they reflected their views, they reflected their opinions. Now, the crucial argument here is as they've declined in size and as they become less civically grounded, political parties have lost this connection. You know, some political scientists, most famously a couple of political party scholars called Katz and Mayer, have gone as far as arguing that political parties have essentially cut themselves off from civil society. They ignore the social, they ignore the civil, and they've become much narrower organisations, more highly professionalised, more determined just to win election through things like mass media campaigns. So in this sense, we can actually argue that the institutionalised connection, yeah, the 20th century model of how we connect citizens with politics has broken down. I mean, it's also interesting, I'll talk about this a little bit in a second, and I'll talk about it when I get to big data as well. And this is one reason to preempt why I don't think big data solves the problem. But it's also really interesting to think about which segments of society feel most alienated from politics. Yeah? And I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about this with regards to UKIP, and particularly Matthew Goodwin from Nottingham University. If you've read his articles, he's been writing in The Guardian a lot and written some really interesting stuff. But what he argues actually is you shouldn't think of UKIP as being right-wing. It's actually disenfranchised voters, people who haven't voted for a number of election cycles, people who feel cut off from politics, who might historically have been embraced by these political parties, but now feel they have no linkage, they have no voice. So there's something going on here, basically, about the institutions that were conceived at the height of modernity to connect citizens with government, with decision-making, or at least make them feel like they were connected, right? We can, again, have that debate about whether it was real or not, but those institutions were a modern-era solution to connection, and they seem to be failing. Let's talk about a broader issue. And this is the sort of narrative that has emerged, particularly, not exclusively since the financial crisis, but become particularly, I think, prominent since it. And this is very much the idea that politicians are not listening to citizens. They are unable to listen to citizens. And this is fueling huge amounts of frustration, or even going as far as to suggest that democracies aren't actually really able to cope with these kinds of crises that we have encountered in recent times. Okay, so one issue here is about representation and representativity. In political science literature, there's two definitions of representativeness. It's a very classic book, which if you're interested in these kind of things, I strongly recommend you reading, by Pitkin, 1967. And this outlines two definitions of representative. So one definition is the kind of Burkean idea, yeah? So you go and vote for someone, and they go and exercise their judgment on your behalf in Parliament. Okay, that's one. It is quite literally a representative. But then the second definition is a lot more problematic, which is, would we want our Houses of Parliament, our Houses of Congress, to actually reflect the makeup of the population, or close to reflect the makeup of the population? In other words, would we want our 650 MPs to look like the 55 million people who live in Britain? Would we want them to be representative of them? So one argument goes here, well, actually, if you look at the kind of broad curve of history, our politicians are getting not more representative, but less representative. Now, there are some areas where that's not the case. I mean, obviously, while not representative of the gender divide in the country, the House of Commons is certainly more representative than it was 50 years ago. But the argument actually being made by some scholars seems to be far more cultural. It's about the backgrounds that these representatives are coming from. Yeah? So they tend to go to a few universities. They tend to have gone to a few schools. But the crucial one, perhaps most of all, and there's really interesting work done on this which argues that it has an impact actually on politicians' long-term careers, is those who've really only worked in professional politics. Yeah? And the argument that Alan makes is actually, if you come into sort of elected politics through the kind of local party route, you become a councillor or a school governor, then you become an MP, you're actually less likely to achieve high office than if you've worked for the Treasury as a special advisor or as a whatever else. So this rise of the professional political class seems to be undermining representativeness in this broader sense of the words. Yeah, we have a professionalisation of politics going on. But we can actually go further, of course, because we can say, well, if we talk about the political class, we don't just mean our elected representatives. We also mean journalists, for example. We mean the broader policy community, people who work in think tanks and such like. By the way, I should say that was a cheap crack about Oxford, because obviously the LSE has its fair share of politicians going on to careers as well. But there's something going on here, which is, of course, that our political class seems to be getting more distant from the lived experience of citizens. And this, of course, fits to some extent with this idea that they are cutting themselves off from civil society, as I outlined earlier. OK. But we can take this idea even further, this idea of sort of the political class cutting themselves off. And I think this becomes particularly apparent since the financial crisis, because there is now an argument, I mean, particularly if any of you read German sociology, I strongly recommend the work of Wolfgang Strecker, who is a German sociologist who's made this argument very forcefully. There's been a big discussion between him and Habermas about the future of the European Union, which is quite entertaining. But particularly in the European Union, there is a real gap about concerns between the wishes of the electorate on the one hand and what are deemed to be the necessary policy prescriptions to cope with financial crisis and austerity on the other. I mean, this is most obviously evident in Greece and Italy, where you essentially have technocratic governments appointed. Yeah? Sometimes governments without any real democratic mandate at all. But it's not just in Europe that we find this. I was at a conference in the US in September, so a little while ago. But it was very interesting talking to American colleagues and about just how depressed they were about their political system and just how they really felt they'd hit an absolute gridlock where it was almost impossible to get anything done. And, you know, they were using words like dysfunctional to me. So, you know, on both sides of the Atlantic, there seems to be this problem that democracy is a recipe either for inertia, if you let it function by itself, or you have to kind of move down the road of technocracy in order to actually combat these problems. And then, of course, and I mean, this was the sort of root cause of the economists' argument about the crisis in democracy, which is that more broadly, sort of non-democratic regimes, less democratic regimes, China, Russia, seem to be coping rather better with the financial crisis than democracies are, than liberal democracies are. And really, of course, what the West might have to learn to cope with, and it's obviously having some kind of existential crisis because of this, is that there might be alternative models out of governance, alternative models of governance out there for the first time since 1989. Although you very nicely said that 2006 is a long time ago, I got into university, which was a little bit before that, writing an essay on Francis Fukuyama's End of History, which shows how long ago it was I actually went to university and did my undergraduate. Because that seems very, very dated now, this idea that there's only one system out there. So the question is really, well, when you have massive crises of the kind that we have gone through and might still be going through, can democratic regimes cope with that? Or do they actually need to disconnect their citizens, as is arguably happening in some parts of the European Union, in order to bring about the necessary policy changes? I'm going to caveat this a bit, because these are big, sort of scary warnings. Yeah, you know, the return of history, rival systems. There's an excellent book by the Cambridge academic, David Runciman, where he actually argues democracy's great strength is it's permanently in a state of crisis. Indeed, he goes as far as to say an election is an organised crisis. And he takes sort of the history of democracy at various points in the 20th century and argues actually that the one thing that really binds this narrative together is the ability to cope with crisis. And while other systems may be very good at coping with, financial crisis, for example, in the short term, because they can essentially have a much more command and control response to it, actually, democracy is rather better in the long term at coping with crisis. They're more nimble, they're more able to cope over the longer term. And also, interesting, this was like the second part of that conversation I had at a conference in the US, where some of my American colleagues were saying, oh, yeah, this is awful, we can't get anything done. But then some older American colleagues said, well, actually, this is just like the 1970s, right? We had exactly the same conversation after Vietnam and Watergate and the oil price rises and, you know, and the Soviet Union seemed to be on the brink of just rising to great power. And so, you know, there was a sense in which, again, this argument, democracy is always in crisis, is not a bad one to make. But I think there is a profound question here, right? And one of the reasons why I think it's a profound question is it actually predates the financial crisis. It just seems more relevant to us now. And I guess I'd kind of go back to what democratic theorists call the neo-pluralists. Yeah? And probably the most approachable and one of the most interesting of these is Colin Crouch, who's at Warwick University. And he's written about, and was writing as early as 2000 about something he called post-democracy. And this really is an argument about, well, how does liberal democracy relate to globalized capitalism? Yeah? And what is the level of freedom for action that governments have? So the first thing to say is, well, obviously, in this system where capital can fly around very, very rapidly, national governments are in a much weaker position. And maybe they're unable to actually respond to the wishes of the electorate. Yeah, so it might be the electorate wishes for something, but actually it's not really a viable option. And what also really happens in this post-democracy is what politicians end up fighting about is an exercise in managerialism. Who can do something more efficiently than someone else? There's a term political scientists use for this. We call it valence issues. Yeah, some of you may have heard this phrase. So in the idealised sort of world of 1950s politics, you had a party that was in favour of nationalisation and a party that was in favour of privatisation. Those kind of debates are over because in the globalised world you can't really even have those debates. But what you do have are parties essentially debating who can do something better. So crime is a good valence issue. We do not have an anti-crime party and a pro-crime party. Yeah? What we have are two parties saying, I'm more anti-crime than the other party. So politics largely becomes a rhetorical exercise. And again, we come back here that the structural response from the political class is to isolate themselves from public feeling. So, I mean, a classic example of this is giving independence to central banks. Yeah, so when the interest rates go up or down, the politicians can put their hand up and say, it wasn't me who did it. And the governor of the bank is beyond the reach of the electorate, or at least in the short or medium term anyway. The rise of quangos, yeah, a British phrase. I don't know how well whether it's used in other countries. Quasi-autonomous non-government organisations. Basically, it means something semi-detached from the government. So what we're here, if you like, we're seeing not only the kind of failing of the institutions of connection, elections, political parties, but we are seeing a rise of institutions that's primary feature is disconnection. Yeah? In other words, isolating political decisions from the will of the public. It's going to get more optimistic in a second. There you go. Right. So the sort of hope here, if you like, and the thing that, lots of people in this room, I hope we have lots of optimists in the room. I'm going to be a little bit sceptical, but that's not because I'm not an optimist. And I hope we have lots of you with great ideas about how actually these technologies can make things better and connect whatever it is you're interested in up. But we all know this narrative, right? Yeah, there's lots of different types of arguments about how the internet and technology can fix lots of the things I've been talking about. Yeah, so whether that be, more open political parties and make it easier for people to engage in campaigns and get involved in activism and go door knocking for Obama, whether that be, more social movement type organisations. Whether that be big data, which I'm going to go and talk about. This was the best picture I could find to illustrate big data. It's a very hard thing to find a picture for. But of course, there are also, as I say, some cynical people out there who say, well, this waters down traditional forms of activism. And, I suspect there will be as many views of that as there are people in this room. But I'm going to talk, let's talk a little bit about first, about these conceptions and some of the dangers, I think, about running away with these big narratives of technology fixing stuff. The first thing to say is that many of the issues with contemporary democracy that I've just outlined are structural. Yeah? So when we start to go a bit deeper, when we start to actually say, oh, it's not about this politician behaving badly, or about how hard it is to mobilise young people. I mean, all these things are true, of course. But when we actually start to look at the deep structural issues, what's the relationship between contemporary capitalism and liberal democracy, then it starts to, I think, become a lot more questionable whether technology can actually fix these problems. The other thing, and I don't know if any of you have sort of had experiences with policymakers or spoken to politicians about these technologies, it's really depressing very often. There are some politicians who are great and get this, and there are some civil servants who are great and get this. I'm not talking about them. There are many, many more who do not. And what they sort of, the phrase I often use to describe this is a bolt-on. Yeah? What they want is to keep their current processes, keep their current institutions, and add some internet to it. You're familiar with this dialogue? Yes, OK. And this is really bad. Yeah? This really simplistic view of technology both undermines its potential and actually has the possibility of making things worse on some occasions, I would argue. OK, so one thing that I think people are talking about around the world, there's a great deal of excitement about it, there's a great deal of excitement about it in academia, is this idea of big data. There are, of course, many, many definitions of big data. I mean, what I am sort of increasingly interested in my research is, I think a lot of work that academics do, and I don't mean, again, probably people in this room, but I think maybe some people who are moving into this area do, is they just harvest a social media data set and call it big data. I mean, it is. I mean, it's bigger. It's far bigger than anything most social scientists would have ever had access to. So in that sense, it's big. But I guess what I'm more interested in now are some of these more complex questions raised when we start to talk about an epistemology of big data. Yeah? So very different ways of understanding the public, very different ways of doing research. For example, when we overlay different data sets of structured and unstructured data. Things we can start to do are very, very complicated, but it raises problems. Now, the hope, of course, here, and this is probably those of you who have been with the policymakers have heard this, yeah, is in theory we'll create a more nimble state, a more responsive state, you know, much better able to react to what the public wants when they want it, even may be able to, and this is, of course, I think what a lot of policymakers are hoping for, even preempt what the public wants, or preempt problems before they emerge. I mean, there was one project I know of, also financial crisis related, where government got very interested. Do you remember Northern Rock? Yeah, so this is where everyone decided the bank was about to go belly up and so wanted their money out. And of course, banks don't actually have enough money to pay out all the money. So they just end up with long queues outside. So government got very interested. Well, could we predict a run on a bank using social media? Yeah, can we actually start to see the antecedents of that and then take a policy response to preempt it before it happens? So, you know, this is the idea, the more nimble state that can actually dodge these bullets before they're even fired. But again, we come back to this issue, well, does this really address the underlying issues of disconnect, all the things that I've just spoken about, these flaws in democracy? So I have written some stuff where I have been moderately optimistic about the potential of big data. And particular, sort of the paradigm I came through at was public opinion theory. Yeah, so this is, I mean, dominated historically by opinion polls, opinion polling methods. And one of the criticisms of opinion polling is that it's very binary. Yeah, so do you agree with proposition A? Yes, no. Obviously, things like focus groups make it more conversational, but the dominant way we think about public opinion is in a very sort of this binary, non-conversational way. Whereas if you take an environment like Twitter, for example, it is potentially really, really conversational. And so, you know, one argument in favour of this is, well, could we have a more conversational mechanism for understanding the public, yeah, that opens up not just a kind of a what question, but why questions and how questions too. So this is the sort of optimistic reading, and I say kind of responds to some particular criticism of traditional public polling methodology. Now, the problem with this, and as I started to delve deeper into sort of the big data research methods, and particularly actually, you know, a lot of the important work I think is being done here at the OII, and so it was sort of quite influential on my thinking here. But actually, of course, this is not necessarily how big data is used. It's certainly not how it's used in the corporate sector. This notion that you harvest what people are saying and you analyse what they're saying what you might actually end up doing is harvesting really, really quite disparate bits of information that the average citizen would have no ability to link together with their political preferences. Yeah, I mean, the phrase is, that is often used as data exhaust for this, yeah? So basically bits and pieces we leave lying around in our kind of digital lifestyles. But there's a real problem with this, I would argue, which is it actually takes us simultaneously, while maybe giving us what we want from politics, you know, maybe means that, I'm trying to think, the passport office would be better able to predict levels of demand before people sent their forms in. But on the other hand, would that connection between expression and policy be clear to citizens? In other words, it's all very well having a connection, but if you don't know the connection's there, what does that mean for civil society? The other problem here, of course, is, well, not everyone is creating these data trails to the same degrees. I go back to the examples of the politically disenfranchised people that have recently been argued to be the explanation for the rise of UKIP. Yeah, I would have a little bet with you, I haven't seen any data on this, but I'd have a little bet with you, they are also exactly the same people likely to produce less data. Yeah? So if we start using these tools to make policy, are we actually entrenching the very same structural political inequalities that are fueling the rise of these anti-system parties, far-right parties? There's another issue here as well, I think. I have to say, I can't claim this point as mine. It was given to me by a friend who works for a polling firm. And we were talking about the ubiquity of polling. Yeah, so one argument I would make, actually, just as an aside, is if anyone says to you that the internet has had no influence on British politics, the absolute killer argument against them is internet polling. Yeah? Companies like YouGov and, in fact, all the major pollsters now do huge amounts of internet polling. It's one of the reasons why we have many, many more polls published during an election campaign, and actually outside of an election campaign, than was previously the case. It's a lot cheaper to do polling than was previously the situation. But this guy who works for a pollster said, well, actually, although they're making more money, he said, well, if you analyse debate and you analyse what we're publishing, he thinks it's a bad thing. Because the point being that they put a poll out about everything, yeah? What do you think of a #1 record? What do you think of the latest celebrity scandal? Is this person on trial guilty or innocent or whatever else? And his view was, well, when it was expensive to do a telephone poll, we only asked important questions. Now what we do is ask incredibly frivolous things. And the value of the average piece of information we're publishing has decreased greatly. And if you kind of take this argument further, which I think is a really interesting one, right? But if you take it further into the big data sort of paradigm, it may be that the information we actually get access to through our newspapers and our news coverage is the frivolous. Yeah, it may be who's tweeting about which person on Big Brother or the X Factor or whatever. Well, lots of information, of course, that's actually used to make real decisions is locked away by private companies or by government, and we don't get either results published, nor can we incriminate the data sets, interrogate the data sets, I beg your pardon. So we might end up with this kind of data apartheid, yeah, where some data is more powerful, but we don't have access to it, and some data is more frivolous, and it's what actually makes up our public sphere. So I think this is a really important potential pitfall. Another issue here, we tend to talk, I don't think it's anyone's fault, but because I think it's really early days for this conversation, yeah? But we tend to talk in generalities. We tend to say government, I've probably done it already, government is interested in big data. But of course, governments are very, very complicated organisations. They have many elements to them, they have many facets. So what do we mean by that? Do we mean the civil service? Well, probably. I mean, we mean the executive? Well, maybe as well. What about MPs? Do we think MPs are going to be interested in big data? Well, most MPs and MPs researchers I've spoken to have said they don't care if a topic is trending on Twitter. They do care if they get half a dozen letters from people they know live in their constituency. So you might, again, end up with these quite different ways of communicating. The other thing, and I think particularly if we think about, say, local councils, is big data is actually quite expensive to do properly, and it requires a high level of skills. So is there going to be a different rebalancing, if you like, of the abilities of, say, national government and local government in their abilities to actually harvest and use this data? So this could actually lead to sort of a fundamental shift, if you like, in the different institutions, the power they have, the way they use information, the information they even regard as being legitimate. I'm conscious that I want to make sure there's time for questions, so I'm going to wrap up with one more slide. OK, I chose to talk about big data today because it's what I'm thinking about at the moment. As I said, there are many other ways of answering this question. You know, you may think that all this big data stuff is nonsense and it gives power to corporations, it's very dangerous. You might actually think that the way to fix some of the problems I've outlined are civil society movements, organising online, and then meeting in the real world. Yeah? And so this is just one facet of this debate I'm entering into, and I really look forward to hearing what other people have to say today from different sides of that debate. But I think wherever you come from, we really, really need to move away from this point that, well, I've said here that technology can fix politics, but maybe that technology can fix anything. Yeah? Because many of the reasons for all the problems we're going to be talking about and all the problems we'll discuss, and I focused on one aspect of disconnect today, but they're structural, yeah, they're social, they're economic, they're political. And indeed, if you like, as this sort of final warning, and I guess this was really my warning on the big data thing, is there is the potential that this can actually push citizens and government even further apart. Yeah, so we might end up in a situation where government is more responsive, more nimble, more able to respond to the wishes of citizens, more able to anticipate pile-ups of passport applications. But if the citizens don't know how that's happened, and they don't associate it with their actions and their wishes, well, then does it even matter at all? Thank you.